Hello and welcome to another tutorial. This tutorial is going to be on how to paint a brick wall, and it's going to be a grey brick wall because the person who's requested this video is doing grey wall. So I've just added my picture from Pinterest as my reference, and I'm going to create a small canvas square on which I'm going to be painting. Essentially, yeah, I'm just dragging in some color and then using the moving tool to move it into a smaller square shape. Also, I decided to just change my canvas to vertical. On this small canvas now, I'm going to add a clipping mask layer on top, and from here on I will begin painting in the brick wall. Of course, you can use any brushes or colors for this painting. I'm going to be using a mixture of my own brushes and original brushes from Procreate, and I'll always give you alternative brushes to use. To start with, I'm using my hard shading brush. As an alternative, you can use a large airbrush like the hard airbrush or the medium hard airbrush. They will do just fine. And then next I'm going in with a Procreate original brush called Stucco, which is always great for texture. And right now I'm just giving the background texture before I move on to adding the squares on top. I'm choosing a slightly lighter color and a slightly darker color than my base color. Now for this next one, I'm going to sketch in essentially the grid where I'm going to add my tiles on, and I'm using the grainy detail brush for that, but as an alternative I would suggest a studio pen from Procreate. I'm also using the drawing grid guide from Procreate, as you can see here, just adjusting the grid size, and then I will start to sketch in where I want to have my tiles lie. I'm going to do this fairly symmetrical. I also love a good wall with varying shapes of stones and bricks, but for this purpose I definitely want to keep it nice and straight. I'm not using the function drawing guide or drawing assist, you know, the one that will draw automatically straight lines for you, but when you draw a line with your brush and then hold it at the end for a couple of seconds, it should straighten out, and there's an option to change the shape of that as well, so that is always really helpful, and that's what I used here. And I ended up copying and pasting the layer with 2 or whatever amount of lines, just so I don't have to paint every single line. I will do the same here. I'm just kind of marking where the border of the tiles will be and wanting to have those, you know, lie kind of exactly like the reference picture. Not exactly, but if you know what I mean. And here I'm going to do the same thing of copying and pasting the layer eventually. Once that's completed, I will remove the drawing grid guide. That was a bit of a mouthful. I'm just going to lower the opacity of the layer so that the sketch is semi-visible only. And then now, for those people who don't have my brushes, I would suggest you put an outline of your tiles on like this, but make sure that the outline is very dense and has no holes anywhere, and then you can fill in the squares like that. I've got the square hollow brush from my set that I'm going to be using for this, just because the shape is already perfectly rectangular / square. And just by adjusting the size, I'm going to paint them in black. You can fill your shapes in with black if you're using the alternative method as well, because it doesn't really matter. I'm going to be adding a clipping mask to this later and then filling in with any color after, so don't worry about the color of these squares, just make sure they're really nice and visible. I will go ahead and just sometimes straighten out my lines here, but most of the time I'm just kind of winging it a little bit because I'm choosing to paint a wall with not the most perfectly rectangular tiles. You know, I think it's fine if they're a little bit wobbly. Halfway through, I'm also gonna go ahead and copy and paste the layer, essentially duplicate it and then move it around a little bit so I don't have to do the work twice. And after this step, I'm going to go in with the erasing tool, choosing a really nice fine brush. In my case, I'll be using the hard details brush from my pack, but I would suggest the studio pen as an alternative. And I'm just gonna go ahead and like erase in between where it's a little bit too well, doesn't look very natural anyways, or where I've kind of overlined it. As you've just seen, I've created a clipping mask out of this layer, and you can always undo that later, but for me it's important to see which parts are actually in the picture and which aren't. And this is kind of how it's going to be looking later when it's nice and neat within the square of your canvas or the rectangular shape. I will be clipping masking it in a minute because I want to create clipping masks on top of this now, on this layer of bricks, and it doesn't really work when you've got it clipping masked to the lower. Well, anyways, I hope I'm not confusing anyone. Just go ahead and unclipping mask it again, and then we'll go ahead and create a new clipping mask on top of that. Before going ahead and shading these bricks now, I'm gonna go and put some colors to the side so I can kind of keep in mind which colors I'm using and what brightness they have essentially. Then I'm gonna go ahead with the hard shading brush of my set. As an alternative, again, any airbrush will do, or any white brush. And with this medium range gray but lighter yellow color, I'm gonna go ahead and shade those in completely. And then lowering the size or decreasing the size of the brush, I'll start adding like a darker color in between the tiles and below and above them, if that makes sense, to just kind of highlight the outline of the brick itself. I'm not going to have a specific light source direction from left or right, the top or whatever. It's kind of just being lit fairly evenly. And so because the tiles are sticking out of the wall a little bit, to show that, I want to make sure that the outlines are prominent, I guess is the word maybe. Next, you can do this on a separate layer if you're unsure if you're gonna like your result. I'm gonna go in with the stucco brush from Procreate and add some darker shading to just get some texture in onto those tiles, and then experimenting a little bit around with the lower with the background color, and by decreasing the opacity of that, it's showing a bit more of the black background, because I wanted to see how much difference in value I wanted to have, how dark and how light contrasting the background and the tiles are going to be. But I decided to keep it at 100% the background, and I'm just going to go ahead and add shadow below the actual tiles on a new layer between the background and the tiles, and B, I'm going to add some highlight to create a lighter shade of the tiles later on. For this step right now, I'm using the grainy detail brush from my set. As an alternative, again, the studio brush, the studio pen will do, or maybe even better, the 6B pencil, something with a little bit of texture, but dense enough, if you know what I mean. I'm just very carefully like edging around the edges of the tiles, and now and again I feel like, well, I'll probably do this at the end, but I will be erasing parts of the tiles to create a better separation between some of them later after this. But I'm kind of adding a bit of shadow around the entire thing, so a little bit at the top, more on the bottom, because I want to kind of have someone standing in front of the wall, and the bottom will create more shade if there is light in the sky, if you know what I mean. So there's a little bit of directionality of light, I suppose. But yeah, I'm creating a little bit more shadow below the tile each individually, and also in between the spaces next to them, next to each other. So because they are quite close next to each other, there will be a lot less light in between. Now you can go in really gently like I am and just kind of inch your way forward, testing out how much shadow you want to add. Or you could simply go in pretty bold and, you know, duplicate the layer that you've already put this outline on, because then it will automatically be stronger. Or you can just go ahead and really go for it. Now changing layers, I'm going onto that brick base, and I'm just going to erase in between some of the tiles to create a bit more boundary, and then I'm going to go ahead and correct that underneath with adding a little bit more outline. Sometimes I've added a bit too much outline, like of shadow below next to the tile. I'm just going to go ahead and erase that. Once I've completed the entire outline of this and I'm happy with it, it should look something like this. For me, as you can see, it still looks very one-dimensional only because the colors are so similar. I'm going to be adding a clipping mask at the very top onto the brick base again, and using a really nice industrial brush from Procreate, I'm gonna go ahead and add some extra texture to start inching towards lighter colors. Of the industrial brushes on Procreate, I'm going to choose Rusted Decay because it's not too intense and doesn't give you too much texture, but it does give you a random varied like stone thingy. And I'm going to go and test a little bit of the lighter color and then brush it in more or less randomly across the entire stone wall. I'm also going to add some more contrast with a darker color. After adding some more contrast with this, I'm going to choose a different Procreate original brush called Evolve, if I'm not mistaken, and I'm going to add some finer detailing texture to the whole thing. Yeah, so the brush is definitely called Evolve, and once I've chosen that and I've done a little bit of the lighter color with Evolve, again I am kind of gently going from lighter to lighter color to just really carefully add more layers of color and light. And I'm gonna do the same and add some darkness with this brush as well to kind of make sure I'm getting a balance of light and dark. Okay, so with every extra layer of light or a lighter color that you add and a bit more darkness and shadowing, I guess you can see how it's kind of coming together bit by bit. I am also going to duplicate the brick base layer in a second and add extra shadow that way without having to sketch some more shadow in. I guess it's a nice lazy trick. Essentially, go onto your layer, and I've already had it duplicated, so I'm just going to tap it, move it slightly to the left bottom, and duplicate it again, and then tap it to the right a bit more. I then adjust the opacity to see how it looks, just lowering both of them a little bit. This has created a little bit more of shadow between the background and the foreground, and then I'm going to continue working on the tiles themselves. I also want to increase the brightness of the bricks, so I'm going to go ahead and choosing the Rusted Decay brush again. I'm going in and adding even brighter highlights, and as you can see we're still moving very much in the mid-tone region, but that will change slowly. I'm going to create 3 versions of these different stone walls, and you can choose which one you prefer to create. For now I'm going to go ahead and merge some layers together to clean them up. I'm really happy with my texture and colors, so I'm going to go ahead and merge all those clipping masks down to the base layer. And then we've got 2 of these ones that create our shadow. I'll merge those together as well, and then choosing the Gaussian blur tool, I'm going to create a bit more shadow that way by blurring out the lines in the background. And you can do that as much or as little as you like, but I'm going to go for 3% exactly, because I only want to blur out the lines a little bit and not to have it too overshadowing. So I've gone ahead and put made a clipping mask out of the remaining layers to the black square thingy, and I've duplicated the entirety of all layers. On the second one I'm going to go ahead and continue modifying it. Choosing the stucco brush and a lighter color, I'm going to add an overall lighter patch across, and then I'm going to go ahead and erase bits and pieces with the industrial brush from earlier, Rusted Decay, just so it's a bit more random. To this part of the wall I wanted to add some greenery, so I chose like an olive green and also the stucco brush again, just to add some texture with this and make it look like moss. And I didn't really like it very much. I erased a lot of it to see how it would look just patched up, and then I went through the blending layer modes and decided to stick with overlay. Even though it looks a little bit yellow, it added a nice bit of color and light to it that I didn't think of adding before. So yeah, I mean color dodge, my bad, it is color dodge, not overlay. Next I go ahead with the grainy detail brush on a new layer and I start adding some very individualized highlights on the edges and across the different tiles. I will add the white or the lighter color throughout the entire brick, just kind of depending on which brick it is, just very randomly. And I'm also going to do that in black, but with the black color or the darker color, I'm going to go ahead and draw some fine lines through the rock to mimic the shape of the reference photos bricks a little bit. Since this green/yellow color that I added earlier looks a little bit too yellowish, I wanted to go ahead and add an overlay layer and then add a little bit of orange/yellow color using the Hearts brush from the artistic category in Procreate brushes. For this part, I've created a new layer, selecting the blending mode of color and then choosing a very light gray. I first chose a darker one, but eventually I'm going to choose a light one, and a broad brush. I'm just going to go over the entire painting, and it grayscales it for you, which is really helpful to see the different values in your painting. But more importantly, if you want to have a purely gray wall and you've chosen some color, you can always grade like this, or if you've got a grayed out painting, you can add color like this. Regardless, I wanted to have a little bit more contrast in the entire painting, so I unhid that layer. I hid the layer and I've duplicated the entire set again of the canvas. Because I have the layer restriction as everyone else on this, I've decided to flatten the first wall, and then I just move it around and we're ready to go. Now I'm going to go ahead and unclipping mask the layer of the wall itself, create a new layer above that and a clipping mask. Then choosing the stucco paintbrush from Procreate and a very light grey color, I'm going to go ahead with the brush size being a bit smaller and just adding light individually to the different bricks. And you don't have to worry about coloring in the entire brick or tile with this, but just kind of randomly placing it, because these different tiles in reality will probably be a little bit more inset than the others, or they will bulge out a bit more depending on their natural shape. Then finally I go ahead and decrease the brightness of the background layer slightly, and that is the final result. I hope this has helped you in your artistic endeavor and you've enjoyed the tutorial. I try to make it nice and short. If you'd like to see more of these videos in the future, please leave me a like, comment or subscribe. I really appreciate it, and I wish you a lovely day.